The population of Puerto Rico has been shaped by Amerindian settlement, European colonization especially under the Spanish Empire, slavery and economic migration. This article is about the demographic features of the population of Puerto Rico, including population density, ethnicity, education level, health of the populace, economic status, religious affiliations and other aspects of the population. History of migration. The inhabitants of Puerto Rico immediately before the first European contact were part of the Arawak group of Amerindians. They called the island Boriken and themselves Boricuas. They were named the Taino by Christopher Columbus, Indiana, 1493. Immigration. The Spanish conquered the island, assuming government in 1508, colonized it, and assumed hegemony over the natives. The Taino population dwindled due to disease, tribal warfare, and forced labor, so the Spanish began importing large numbers of slaves from Africa. Spanish men arrived on the island disproportionately to Spanish women. Taino women would sometimes marry them, resulting in a mestizo, or mixed ethnicity. In the late 18th century, the number of African slaves began to dwindle on the island. The British ban on slavery resulted in slave raids on Puerto Rico. Many slaves also escaped to neighboring islands. During the 19th century, large numbers of immigrants from Spain, as well as numerous Spaniards living in former Spanish colonies in South America, also arrived in Puerto Rico. Although the vast majority of settlers came from Spain, Catholics from France, Ireland, Italy and other European countries were also granted land from Spain during the Real Sigilo de Gracias de 1815, were allowed to settle in the island with a certain amount of free land and enslaved persons. This mass immigration during the 19th century helped the population grow from 155,000 in 1800 to almost a million at the close of the century. During the early 20th century, Jews began to settle in Puerto Rico. The first large group of Jews to settle in Puerto Rico were European refugees fleeing German-occupied Europe in the 1930s. Puerto Rico's economic boom of the 1950s attracted a considerable number of Jewish families from the U.S. mainland, who were joined after 1959 by an influx of Jewish émigrés from Castro's Cuba. Immigration has been a major part of Puerto Rico's recent history as well. Starting in the post-World War II period, waves of Puerto Ricans moved to the continental United States, particularly to New York City, Newark, Jersey City, Paterson, and Camden, New Jersey, Chicago, Providence, Rhode Island, Springfield and Boston, Massachusetts, Orlando, Miami and Tampa, Florida, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Hartford, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, California. This continued even as Puerto Rico's economy improved and its birth rate declined. The 2010 census in fact recorded Puerto Rico's first population drop in history. Puerto Rico's demographics are therefore atypical for Latin America, and instead more resemble those of many Eastern European countries such as Romania or Lithuania. Vital statistics. Structure of the population. Race and ethnic group. Racial demographic history. The first census by the United States in 1899 reported a population of 953,243 inhabitants, 61.8% of them classified as white, 31.9% as mixed, and 6.3% as black. A strong European immigration wave and large importation of slaves from Africa helped increase the population of Puerto Rico over six-fold during the 19th century. No major immigration wave occurred during the 20th century. The Federal Naturalization Act, signed into law on March 26, 1790, by President Washington, explicitly barred anyone not of the white race from applying for U.S. citizenship. This law remained in effect until the 1950s, although its enforcement was tightened in the late 19th century regarding Asian immigrants, and by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 imposing immigration quotas. In short, until the middle of the 20th century, only immigrants of the white race could hope to become naturalized citizens. Until 1950, the U.S. Bureau of the Census attempted to quantify the racial composition of the island's population, while experimenting with various racial taxonomies. In 1960, the census dropped the racial identification question for Puerto Rico but included it again in the year 2000. The only category that remained constant over time was white, even as other racial labels shifted greatly, from colored to black, mulatto, and other. Regardless of the precise terminology, the census reported that the bulk of the Puerto Rican population was white from 1899 to 2000. In the late 1700s, Puerto Rico had laws like the Regla del Saque Gracias al Saque, where a person of mixed ancestry could be considered legally white so long as they could prove that at least one person per generation in the last 4 generations had also been legally white. Therefore, people of mixed ancestry with known white lineage were classified as white, the opposite of the one-drop rule in the United States. According to the 1920 Puerto Rico census, 2,505 individuals immigrated to Puerto Rico between 1910 and 1920. Of these, 2,270 were classified as white in the 1920 census. During the same 10-year period, 7,873 Puerto Ricans emigrated to the U.S. Of these, 6,561 were listed as white on the U.S. mainland census, 909 as Spanish white, and 403 as black. Genetic studies. Puerto Ricans, on average, have genetic contributions from Europeans, West Africans, and Native Americans of approximately 66%, 18%, and 16%, respectively. A recent study of mitochondrial DNA from 800 individuals found that patrilineal input, as indicated by the Y chromosome, showed 66% of Puerto Ricans could trace their ancestry to male European ancestors, 18% could trace it to male African ancestors, and 16% could trace it to male Native American ancestors. As for maternal DNA, 61.1% of those sampled were found as having Amerindian maternal mtDNA. This means that if a person could trace back in time from daughter to mother, she would eventually reach women who lived in Puerto Rico in pre-Columbian time. The rest divides between 26.4% with female African ancestors and 12.5% with female European ancestors. Both of these findings are consistent with the popular belief from historical record that male European immigrants took for themselves wives from among the native Indian and, later, black slave populations. Women in the diaspora. In a study done on Puerto Rican women born on the island but living in New York by Carolina Bernier, Mark D. Shriver and Esteban Parra in 2004, the ancestry proportions corresponding to the 3 parental populations were found to be 53.3 plus or minus 2.8% European, 29.1 plus or minus 2.3% West African, and 17.6 plus or minus 2.4% Native American based on autosomal ancestry informative markers. Although autosomal markers tests seem to draw a more broad picture than that of single, gender-based mtDNA and Y chromosome tests, the problem with autosomal DNA is in the archaic categories used: European, Sub-Saharan African, East Asian, and AMP, Native American. American, Asian, and North African are not included. These generalized categories may not take into account the complexity of migratory patterns across the Old World. The study also found that, from the women sampled, 98% had European ancestry markers, 87% had African ancestry markers, 84% had Native American ancestry markers, 5% showed only African and European markers, 4% showed mostly Native American and European markers, 2% showed only African markers, and 2% showed mostly European markers. These findings are consistent with the historical record that the native male Taino population was virtually wiped out shortly after the arrival of the Spanish invaders to the island. Religion. There are many religious beliefs represented in the island. Religious breakdown in Puerto Rico. Christians. Christian denominational breakdown. Catholics. The Roman Catholic Church has been historically the most dominant religion of the majority of Puerto Ricans, with Puerto Rico having the first dioceses in the Americas. Protestants. The presence of various Protestant denominations has increased under American sovereignty, making modern Puerto Rico an interconfessional country. Protestantism was suppressed under the Spanish regime, but encouraged under American rule of the island. An example of this was with the Holy Trinity Anglican Church in Ponce, which was prevented from ringing its bell until 1898, when American troops landed there. Muslims. In 2007, there were over 5,000 Muslims in Puerto Rico, representing about 0.13% of the population. There are 8 Islamic mosques spread throughout the island, with most Muslims living in Rio Piedras. Puerto Rican converts to Islam continues to occur. Ties between Latinos and Islam are more than just spiritual, but date back to Spanish history. Many people do not realize that Muslims ruled Spain for more than 700 years. And at times not just individuals but whole families convert. However, lack of Muslim education in the island forces some Puerto Rican Muslims to migrate to the States. Islam was brought into Puerto Rico mainly via the Palestinian migration of the 1950s and 60s. Thus, today there is a strong Palestinian presence among Muslims in Puerto Rico. They are economically strong and thus able to pay for a full-time imam. Jews. Puerto Rico is also home to the largest Jewish community in the Caribbean with 3,000 Jewish inhabitants. Some Puerto Ricans have converted, not only as individuals but as entire families. Puerto Rico is the only Caribbean island in which the conservative, Reform and Orthodox Jewish movements are represented. Pagans. Taino religious practices have been rediscovered, reinvented by a handful of advocates. Various African religious practices have been present since the arrival of enslaved Africans, in particular, the Yoruba beliefs of Santeria and/or Ifa, and the Congo-derived Palomeum find adherents among individuals who practice some form of African traditional religion. CIA World Factbook Demographic Statistics. The following demographic statistics are from the CIA World Factbook, unless otherwise indicated. Population: 3,725,789. Gender: men, 1,785,171. Women, 1,940,618. Age structure: 0 to 17 years, 24.2%; to 18 to 24 years, 10.1%; 25 to 34 years, 13.2%; 35 to 49 years, 19.6%; 50 to 64 years, 18.3%; 65 years and over, 14.6%. Infant mortality rate: total 8.1%. 7.23 deaths, 1,000 live births, male 9 deaths, 1,000 live births, female 7.43 deaths, 1,000 live births. Life expectancy at birth, total population 78.77 years, male 75.15 years, female 82.57 years, total fertility rate 1.62 children born, woman, nationality, none, Puerto Rican, adjective, Puerto Rican ethnic groups, white 75.8%, Black 12.4%, Asian 0.2%, Amerindian 0.5%, Mixed and other 11.1%, religions, Roman Catholic 85%, Protestant and other 15%, languages, Spanish, English,